They entered human space with thousands of ships. Only one survived. Far beyond the edge of the Milky Way, in a region of space that no human telescope had ever mapped, the Vashtar Dominion ruled over 400 star systems. They were an old species, older than most in the galaxy, and they had built their empire the same way every empire before them had been built, through conquest. When the Vashtar found a world with life, they studied it. When they found a world with intelligent life, they judged it. And when that judgment came back weak, they took it. For 3,000 years, no species had ever said no to the Vashtar. Entire civilizations had bowed before their fleets, without a single shot fired. Because the stories of what happened to those who resisted were enough. The stories were true. The Vashtar had erased 6 species from history for the crime of standing their ground. Bones did not lie, and bones were all that remained of those who fought back. The Vashtar were tall, thin creatures with gray skin and 4 eyes, 2 of which could see in the infrared spectrum. They did not have emotions the way humans understood them. They had something closer to a calm, endless certainty. They believed the universe belonged to the strong, and they believed, without question, that they were the strongest thing in it. High Marshal Threx Collin had commanded the Vashtar Third Fleet for over 100 years. He was old even by Vashtar standards, and in that time, he had personally overseen the conquest of 11 worlds. He did not enjoy war. He simply understood it as the natural order of things, the same way water understood how to flow downhill. When his scouts brought him news of a new species near the edge of Vashtar space, he did what he always did. He listened, and he planned. The species was called humans. They lived on a single world called Earth, in a solar system with an unremarkable yellow star. The Vashtar scout ship that found them had been damaged and drifting, running silent sensors only, watching from a distance for 11 months before slipping away undetected. What it recorded confused the Vashtar scientists back home. Humans were young. By galactic standards, they were barely out of their cradle. They had only left their homeworld a few centuries ago, and only truly begun exploring the stars in the last 100 years. And yet the data showed something strange. Human ships were fast. Human weapons improved at a pace no one had ever recorded before, sometimes changing within months instead of decades. Human colonies expanded in ways that seemed careless, almost reckless, spreading out instead of consolidating, as if they did not fear being spread thin. Most alarming to the Vashtar scientists was a pattern they found buried in old radio transmissions humans had been broadcasting into space for over a century, long before they had any real ships at all. The transmissions were full of stories, not reports, not data, but stories. Stories of humans fighting wars against each other and surviving. Stories of small groups of humans defeating larger groups through sheer will. Stories of humans refusing to give up, even when every reasonable calculation said they should. The Vashtar Science Council debated this for years. Some said it meant nothing, that humans were simply undisciplined and their stories were exaggerations, the way all young species exaggerated their own importance. Others were more cautious. They pointed out that humans seemed to treat impossible odds, not as a reason to surrender, but as a kind of fuel. This worried the cautious ones. An enemy that grew stronger from despair instead of breaking under it was a strange kind of enemy. But strange was not the same as dangerous, and in the end, the council voted the way it always voted. Humans were young. Humans were few. Humans had one homeworld and a handful of colonies, none of them fortified in any serious way. The decision was made to add Earth and its system to the Dominion. High Marshal Threx was given command of the invasion. He requested more ships than he had ever requested before, not because he thought humans could win, but because he had learned over 100 years of conquest that the fastest way to end a war was to make it look hopeless from the very first moment. A fleet large enough to blot out the stars over a planet's sky did more to break a species' will than any battle ever could. He wanted this war to be short. He wanted it to be quiet. He wanted humanity to look up, see what was coming, and simply stop. The Dominion gave him 4,300 ships. It was the largest single fleet the Vashtar had ever assembled for one target. Warships of every class filled the assembly point at the edge of Dominion space. Heavy dreadnoughts the size of small moons, swarms of fast attack craft, troop transports carrying soldiers meant to walk onto Earth's surface once its defenses were silenced, and support vessels to keep the fleet fed and fueled for a campaign that no one expected to last more than a few weeks. Threx stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Dominion's Will, and looked out at the assembled fleet through the viewport. 4,300 ships stretched out before him like a second sky, running lights blinking in slow, disciplined patterns. He felt something close to pride, though he would never have called it that. He felt certainty. This was how conquest was supposed to look: overwhelming, inevitable, final. His second-in-command, a younger officer named Vesk, approached him quietly. Vesk had studied the human transmissions more closely than most, and something about them had never sat right with him. "Marshal," Vesk said, "I have reviewed the intercepted signals once more. There is a phrase the humans use often, in many of their languages, in many of their stories. It does not translate cleanly, but the closest meaning is something like, 'We do not know how to lose.'" Threx did not turn from the viewport. "Every young species believes that about itself, Vesk. It is the arrogance of youth. They have not yet learned what losing looks like." "Perhaps," Vesk said, "but I have also found something else. In nearly every recorded human conflict, when one side possessed overwhelming force, and the other side possessed almost nothing, the side with nothing did not always lose. Sometimes they won. Sometimes they won badly, at terrible cost, but they won. I count 17 examples in their own history, and I have not finished searching." Threx finally turned to look at him. "You are worried." "I am cautious, Marshal. There is a difference." Threx considered this for a long moment. He had led enough campaigns to know that caution was not weakness. It was the reason he was still alive after 100 years of war, while braver officers had died young. But he had also learned that some numbers simply could not be argued with. 4,300 warships against a single system, with no fleet worth mentioning, no allies, and no experience fighting anything beyond their own kind. There was no version of the coming battle where the mathematics favored the humans. "Note your concerns in the official log," Threx said. "They will be considered. But we proceed as planned. We jump to the edge of their system in 3 days. We give them one chance to surrender before we begin. If they are wise, this will be over before it truly begins." Vesk bowed his head and said nothing more, though the uneasy feeling in his chest did not leave him. 3 days later, the Vashtar fleet made the jump. They emerged at the outer edge of the solar system humans called home, far past the orbit of the system's last icy planet, in a slow and careful formation, designed to let their sensors map everything before moving closer. What they found in those first hours puzzled them. There was no welcoming committee. There was no panicked evacuation fleet fleeing toward the outer colonies. There was, as far as their sensors could tell, almost nothing at all. A handful of small unmanned probes drifted near the edge of the system, silent and old, clearly abandoned decades ago. Beyond that, the system seemed nearly empty of any military presence. Threx found this troubling in a different way than Vesk's warnings had been troubling. An empty system could mean humans truly were as unprepared as the initial reports suggested. Or it could mean something else. He ordered the fleet to advance slowly, in disciplined formation, sensors at maximum range, weapons ready but not active. He was not a fool, whatever his certainty. 100 years of war had taught him that the enemy you cannot see is the one you should fear most. It took the fleet 6 days to cross the outer system at a cautious pace. In that time, they detected small automated relay stations, some old mining equipment abandoned around the gas giants, and faint traces of shipping lanes that suggested human commerce moved through this region regularly, though no ships were currently present. It was, in a strange way, exactly what a young civilization's outer system should look like: undefended, unremarkable, vulnerable. On the 7th day, as the fleet crossed the orbit of the 4th planet, a single automated buoy activated. It broadcast a message in a language the Vashtar's translation systems processed instantly, since humans had been transmitting their languages into open space for over a century, giving any listener plenty of material to learn from. The message was simple. It identified the system as sovereign human territory. It stated that any armed vessel found within the system without prior authorization would be considered a hostile act. It gave no threats, no boasts, no pleading. It was almost bureaucratic in its tone, like a warning sign posted at the edge of private property. Threx found this almost amusing. A single automated buoy, warning off a fleet of 4,300 warships, as if the numbers meant nothing. He ordered his communications officer to send the standard first message, the one the Vashtar had sent to every species before it fell under Dominion rule. It offered humanity a choice: submit peacefully and become a protected part of the Dominion, retaining their world and much of their way of life under Vashtar governance, or resist and be removed. The message took nearly an hour to reach the inner system and receive a response, the delay caused by the sheer distance still separating the fleet from Earth. When the response finally came, it was not from a government leader, or a military commander, or any official voice at all. It was a short audio clip, translated instantly by the fleet's systems, spoken by a human voice that sounded calm, almost bored. "We got your message. Thanks, but no thanks." That was all. Threx stood in silence on the bridge of the Dominion's will for a long moment after the message finished playing. Around him, his officers exchanged glances, uncertain how to react to a response so brief, so casual, in the face of the largest invasion fleet most of them had ever served in. Vesk, standing near the tactical station, felt the uneasy feeling in his chest grow heavier. "They understand what we are," one of the younger officers said. "Do they not understand what is coming?" "They understand," Threx said slowly. "They simply do not care." He turned to face his bridge crew, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt a flicker of something he did not have a word for in his own language, something the humans might have called doubt. "Advance the fleet," he said. "Full formation. We proceed to the inner system as planned." The order was carried out. 4,300 ships moved deeper into human space, their engines burning bright against the dark, their formation as disciplined and overwhelming as it had been the day it left Dominion territory. Behind them, the empty outer system fell silent once more, the automated buoy continuing to broadcast its quiet, unbothered warning into the void. Ahead of them, unseen and unheard, human sensor networks that had been watching the fleet since the moment it entered the system quietly relayed everything they had gathered back toward Earth, where a very different kind of preparation had already been underway for years, built not on desperation, but on something the Vashtar had never once considered when they studied humanity's strange and reckless-seeming expansion into the stars. They had never once considered that maybe, just maybe, the recklessness was not carelessness at all. Maybe it was confidence. And maybe that confidence had been earned. Somewhere deep beneath the surface of Earth, in command centers built decades before any human had ever seen a Vashtar ship, screens lit up with the same sensor data the fleet had unknowingly been broadcasting simply by existing. Officers who had trained for this exact scenario for years began quietly, calmly, without panic, activating systems that had been dormant, waiting, for a very long time. The Vashtar fleet continued its advance, confident, disciplined, and utterly unaware that the empty, undefended system they believed they were crossing had never been empty at all. It had simply been waiting. High Marshal Threx did not know it yet, but the war he believed would be over in weeks had already begun the moment his scouts first detected Earth's radio signals, years before his fleet ever arrived. And it was not going to end the way he expected. The Vashtar fleet crossed the orbit of Mars 11 days after entering the system. By then, High Marshal Threx had grown used to the strange quiet of human space. No ships had risen to meet them. No desperate broadcasts had begged for mercy. The only sign that anyone on Earth even knew they were coming was that single short reply, delivered almost a week ago, still echoing in the back of his mind. "We got your message. Thanks, but no thanks." He had ordered his intelligence officers to study every scrap of information they could gather as the fleet advanced, hoping to understand what kind of defense, if any, humanity was preparing. What they found only deepened the strange feeling that had settled over the fleet. Earth's inner system showed clear signs of industry, shipping, and settlement, yet almost no visible military buildup. A handful of orbital platforms circled Earth and its moon, but Vashtar sensors classified them as civilian infrastructure, not weapons platforms. There were no visible battle fleets gathering. There were no defensive minefields, no orbital fortresses, nothing that matched what the Vashtar would have expected from a species preparing to face the largest invasion force in Dominion history. Vesk found this more troubling than anything else. He stood beside Threx on the bridge, watching the sensor readouts update in real time as the fleet crept closer to the human homeworld. "They are not preparing to fight us," Vesk said quietly, "or they have already finished preparing, and we simply cannot see it." "Every species hides its true strength until the last possible moment," Threx said. "This is not new. We will find their fleet, wherever it waits. And if there is no fleet to find?" Threx did not answer. He had led enough campaigns to know that silence before a battle rarely meant an enemy had given up. It usually meant the opposite. On the 14th day, the fleet reached the edge of what Vashtar sensors mapped as Earth's orbital defense perimeter, a loosely organized ring of satellites, stations, and traffic control platforms that stretched out from the planet in a wide, thin shell. Threx ordered the fleet to halt at a cautious distance, still well outside effective weapons range by Vashtar standards, and sent a second message down toward the planet. This one was shorter than the first. It gave humanity 24 hours to respond with terms of surrender, or the bombardment of key military and industrial targets would begin. The response came faster this time, in under 2 hours. It was not audio. It was a short video message, and when it played on the bridge of the Dominion's will, every officer present fell silent. The message showed a single human, standing in what appeared to be a plain, undecorated room, wearing a simple gray uniform, with no obvious rank markings the Vashtar could identify. The human was a woman, middle-aged by human standards, with short dark hair and calm, steady eyes. She did not shout. She did not plead. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have already made peace with whatever comes next. "This is Fleet Admiral Elena Cross, Sole Defense Command. To the commander of the fleet currently sitting outside our home, I want to make sure you understand something before this goes any further. We know who you are. We know what you've done to other species that stood in your way. We've known about you for longer than you think, and we've had a long time to get ready." She paused, and for a brief moment, something almost like sympathy crossed her face. "You gave us a choice. I appreciate that, but I think you're about to learn something about us that your scouts missed. We don't measure ourselves by the size of the fleet in front of us. We measure ourselves by whether we're willing to fight for what's ours, no matter the odds. And we are. So here's our answer. Come and get it." The message ended. The bridge of the Dominion's will remained silent for a long moment afterward. Threx stared at the frozen final frame of the human admiral's face, searching it for any sign of bluff, any flicker of desperation hiding behind the calm words. He found none. Whatever this Elena Cross believed, she believed it completely. "Bring the fleet to full alert," Threx said finally. "Begin the approach. If they will not surrender, we will remove their ability to resist, one target at a time, until they change their answer." The order rippled through the fleet. 4,300 ships shifted from cautious advance formation into a wide, layered attack configuration. Heavy dreadnoughts moving to the front, fast attack craft spreading out along the flanks, troop transports and support vessels holding back in a protected core. It was a formation the Vashtar had used for 3,000 years, refined across countless conquests, designed to overwhelm any defense a young species could possibly muster. As the fleet began its final approach toward Earth, sensors began picking up new activity. Small vessels, far smaller than anything the Vashtar would have classified as a warship, began emerging from hidden positions scattered throughout the system. Some rose from concealed bases on the far side of the moon. Others emerged from what had been classified as ordinary asteroid mining operations in the belt beyond Mars. Still more appeared seemingly out of nowhere near Earth's own orbital shell, as if they had been sitting there, powered down and invisible to sensors the entire time. Vesk watched the numbers climb on his tactical display, with a growing sense of unease. "Marshal, we are detecting approximately 600 vessels forming up near the human homeworld. Configuration unknown. Size is significantly smaller than our own warships." Threx studied the readout. 600 ships was a fraction of his own fleet's numbers, barely more than an eighth. Even if every one of them was a genuine warship, the mathematics of the coming battle still overwhelmingly favored the Dominion. He allowed himself a small measure of relief. This, at least, was the kind of resistance he understood. A defending force, badly outnumbered, making it stand anyway. It was tragic in its way. It was also, he believed, going to be short. "Continue the advance," he ordered. Target their formation with long-range fire once we are within effective range. Do not allow them to close to melee distance, if it can be avoided. The Vashtar fleet pressed forward, and the 600 human ships held their position near Earth's orbit, neither advancing to meet them nor retreating. To Threx, it looked like a group preparing to die where they stood, refusing to run, even when running might have bought them more time. He had seen this kind of last stand before, on other worlds, from other species. It never changed the outcome. It only changed how long the fighting lasted. What Threx did not know, what none of the Vashtar knew, was that those 600 ships were not humanity's defense fleet at all. They were bait. 300 million kilometers away, in a deep space monitoring station, built into the hollowed-out core of an asteroid that had been quietly moved into position over a decade earlier, Admiral Elena Cross watched the same sensor data the Vashtar fleet was generating, relayed to her through a network of passive sensors, so old and so well hidden that Vashtar scanning technology had never once detected them. She sat in a small command room, surrounded by a handful of senior officers, watching the enemy fleet's formation update in real time. "They're taking the shape we expected," said Colonel Marcus Webb, her chief tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man who had spent the last 6 years of his life helping design the very defense network now humming to life across the solar system. Heavy ships up front, fast attack craft on the flanks, support corps in the back. Textbook conquest formation. They've done this a lot of times before. "They have," Cross said, "and it's worked every time, because every time before this, they were fighting someone who thought a battle meant lining up 2 fleets and seeing which one had more ships when the smoke cleared." She looked at the display, at the 600 small human vessels holding their position near Earth, deliberately visible, deliberately vulnerable. Every ship in that formation had a skeleton crew, most of them volunteers, who understood exactly what their role in the coming battle was going to be. It was not an easy thing to ask of anyone, but every single one of them had said yes without hesitation, because every single one of them understood something the Vashtar had never bothered to learn about humanity in all their years of watching from a distance. Humans had never fought fair fights when they had a choice. Not against enemies who outmatched them. Every great human victory against impossible odds throughout their long, violent history had been won not by matching an enemy's strength, but by finding the one place that strength did not reach, and striking there with everything they had. "Sir," said a young lieutenant monitoring the sensor feeds, "the enemy fleet has entered extreme long range. They'll be in effective firing range within the hour." Cross nodded slowly. "Good, let them get there. Let them start firing on Fleet Group Anvil exactly the way they planned." "And then?" Webb asked, though he already knew the answer. He had helped write the plan himself. "And then," Cross said, "we show them what happens when 4,300 ships walk into a system that's been waiting for them for 15 years. Across the solar system, hidden in positions no Vashtar sensor had ever mapped, buried inside asteroids, tucked behind the radiation shadow of gas giants, sitting dormant along shipping lanes that looked, to any outside observer, like nothing more than ordinary commercial traffic routes, the true defense of Earth began, quietly and without fanfare, to wake up. High Marshal Threx Cullen gave the order to open fire on the human formation the moment his weapons officers confirmed they were within effective range. Beams of concentrated energy lanced out from the front ranks of the Vashtar fleet, tearing across the gap between the two forces, and the first human ships in Fleet Group Anvil began to die exactly as planned, their crews already having transmitted their final data logs, their sacrifice already accounted for in a strategy built over 15 patient years. Threx watched the human ships begin to burn and fall silent on his tactical display, and for the first time since entering this strange, quiet system, he allowed himself to believe that this war might truly end as quickly as he had promised his emperor it would. He did not yet understand that he had just given the order that would trigger the largest ambush in the history of the Dominion. He did not yet understand that every ship in his massive fleet had just crossed into a kill zone that had been mapped, measured, and prepared for longer than most of his junior officers had been alive. He would understand very soon. The first 30 minutes of the battle went exactly as High Marshal Threx Cullen expected. His long-range weapons tore through the small human formation near Earth's orbit one ship at a time, and the humans, to his surprise, did not break and scatter the way most defending forces did. When the true weight of Vashtar firepower became clear, they held their line. They returned fire with weapons that were clearly far weaker than anything the Dominion carried, weapons that barely scratched the shields of his outer ships, and they kept holding, ship after ship dying in bright, silent flashes on his tactical display, until Threx began to wonder if this Admiral Cross intended to fight to the very last vessel, out of nothing more than stubborn pride. He should have wondered why she was willing to spend 600 ships on a fight she had to know she could not win. The answer came 38 minutes into the battle, when the first Vashtar dreadnought at the front of the formation, a massive vessel named the Endless Dominion, suddenly lost all power across its forward third. Alarms blared across its bridge, as internal sensors reported a cascading failure in its main reactor coupling, a failure that made no sense, since nothing had struck the ship in that location. Before its crew could even begin diagnosing the problem, 3 more ships nearby reported the same impossible failure. Then 5 more. Then a dozen. Vesk, standing at the tactical station on the Dominion's will, felt his 4 eyes widen as the reports flooded in, faster than he could read them. "Marshal, we are losing power systems across the front line. No impact signatures. No weapons fire detected against the affected ships." "Sabotage," Threx said immediately, his mind racing through possibilities. "Boarding parties, hidden agents, something planted before we arrived." "No, Marshal. The failures are originating from outside the ships. Something is being transmitted into our systems." It took the Vashtar's own engineers another 6 minutes to understand what was happening, and by the time they understood it, 31 ships along the front of the fleet had gone dark. Humanity had spent decades studying every scrap of Vashtar technology they could gather from long-range scans, intercepted signals, and the wreckage of the one scout ship that had drifted too close to an inhabited system years earlier, and been quietly, secretly captured rather than destroyed. From that wreckage, human engineers had reverse-engineered enough of the Dominion's communication and power distribution architecture to build something devastating, a targeted electromagnetic weapon, tuned with frightening precision to the exact frequencies Vashtar ships used to regulate their reactor cores. The 600 ships of Fleet Group Anvil had never been meant to win a battle of firepower. They had been meant to die close enough to the Vashtar formation to deliver this weapon at point-blank range, disguised as ordinary weapons fire too weak to be taken seriously. Every human ship lost in the first 30 minutes had been trading its own destruction for the chance to cripple 1 or 2 Vashtar vessels from the inside. "Cut off their transmissions," Threx ordered, his calm beginning to fray for the first time since the campaign began. "Shield the reactor systems. Isolate the affected frequencies." "Marshal, it is already spreading through the fleet's own communication network," Vesk said, horror creeping into his voice. "The affected ships are relaying the disruption to nearby vessels through our own coordination channels." It was, Threx realized with a cold, sinking feeling, a trap built specifically to exploit the very discipline and coordination that had made the Vashtar fleet so effective for 3,000 years. The tighter their formation, the faster their fleet-wide communication, the faster the disruption spread. He gave the order to break formation and scatter, to cut all but essential communication between ships, but the order came too late for the front third of his fleet. By the time the scattered ships managed to isolate the threat, over 200 vessels had lost power entirely, drifting dead in space, easy targets for anything that came next. And something did come next. From behind the icy rings of the outer planets, from concealed positions along asteroid belts that Vashtar sensors had mapped as empty rock, and from beneath the surface of Earth's own moon, humanity's true fleet emerged. It was not large by Vashtar standards. It numbered perhaps 300 ships, far smaller than the crippled Vashtar formation even after its losses. But every ship in that fleet had been built, tested, and refined over 15 years, specifically to fight this exact enemy, using intelligence gathered from decades of careful, patient observation. Admiral Elena Cross watched the disruption weapons effects ripple through the enemy fleet from her command station, and allowed herself a small, tight breath of relief. 15 years of planning, of arguing with skeptical politicians for funding, of asking young men and women to volunteer for a mission that meant almost certain death. All of it had led to this single moment, and it had worked exactly as her engineers promised it would. "Fleet Group Sentinel is in position," Colonel Webb reported, "all 300 vessels ready to engage." "Send the order," Cross said. "Target the crippled ships first. Take out anything that's lost power before they can restore it." Then hit the formations that are trying to scatter. Do not let them regroup. The human fleet surged forward, and unlike Fleet Group Anvil, these were not sacrificial vessels armed with weak weapons, designed for a single desperate purpose. These were true warships, built with technology humanity had kept hidden from every scan, every intercepted signal, every scrap of intelligence the Vashtar had gathered over their years of quiet observation. Human engineers had learned that they could never match the raw size or armor of a Vashtar dreadnought, so they had never tried. Instead, they built ships around speed, precision, and weapons designed to exploit the specific weaknesses humanity had identified in Vashtar shielding technology during years of careful study. The battle that followed was unlike anything Threx had experienced in 100 years of war. His fleet, still recovering from the initial disruption and now scattering according to his own emergency orders, found itself unable to reform the tight, disciplined formations that had won every battle the Dominion had ever fought. The human ships moved fast, faster than Vashtar sensors could easily track, striking at crippled and isolated vessels before darting away, refusing to engage the still functional heavy dreadnoughts head-on. "They are not fighting us," Vesk said, watching the tactical display with growing dismay. "They are fighting the ships we have already lost. They are finishing what the disruption weapon started." Threx forced himself to think clearly through the chaos. 200 ships lost to the initial attack, the rest of his fleet scattered and struggling to reform. A smaller but faster enemy force picking off the wounded before turning to the healthy. It was, he realized with grim clarity, exactly the kind of asymmetric warfare Vesk had warned him about weeks earlier, drawn directly from the pattern of human history he had dismissed as mere storytelling. "Reform the fleet around the surviving dreadnoughts," Threx ordered. "Full firepower, ignore the fast attack craft, focus everything on establishing a defensive core. If we can concentrate our firepower, their speed will not save them." It was a sound tactical decision, the kind that had won battles for the Dominion for 3,000 years, and for a while, it seemed to work. The surviving Vashtar dreadnoughts, still numbering well over 2,000 vessels even after their losses, began pulling together into a tighter defensive formation, their combined firepower creating overlapping fields of fire that even the fast human ships found difficult to penetrate, without taking losses of their own. But Admiral Cross had planned for this too. "They're consolidating," Webb reported, "forming a hardpoint around their remaining dreadnoughts. Standard defensive doctrine." "Let them," Cross said. "That's exactly what we want. Bring up the second wave." Deep within the asteroid belt, and hidden along trajectories that had looked, to Vashtar long-range sensors, like nothing more than natural debris fields drifting through the system, a third human force began to move. These were not warships at all, not in the traditional sense. They were massive automated platforms, built in secret over more than a decade, each one carrying enough long-range kinetic weaponry to level a city, designed for exactly one purpose: to strike a concentrated, stationary target from a distance no Vashtar ship could hope to close in time. As the Vashtar fleet drew itself into a tight defensive formation, exactly the response humanity had spent years predicting and preparing for, the first kinetic strikes began to fall. There was no elegant beam weapon, no dramatic energy blast, just solid mass, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light, striking the tightly packed Vashtar formation with the force of small planetary impacts. Ships that had survived the initial disruption weapon, ships that had reformed into what their commanders believed was an unbreakable defensive wall, began to die in numbers that made the earlier losses look small by comparison. Threx watched the reports come in, watched the tactical display fill with red markers signaling destroyed or disabled vessels, and for the first time in over 100 years of service to the Dominion, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to the cold, dawning understanding that everything he believed about how wars were won might be wrong, and that he had led the largest fleet in Dominion history directly into a trap 15 years in the making. "Marshal," Vesk said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "current fleet strength is down to approximately 1,800 vessels, and falling. Recommend immediate withdrawal." Threx stared at the display for a long moment, at the wreckage of what had been, only hours earlier, the mightiest fleet the Vashtar Dominion had ever assembled. He thought of the human admiral's calm, steady voice, the words she had spoken without a hint of doubt. We don't measure ourselves by the size of the fleet in front of us. He was beginning to understand what she meant. Sound the general withdrawal, Threx said quietly. All ships, fall back to the outer system rally point. We regroup and reassess. The order went out across what remained of the fleet, but even as it did, Threx already understood, with the cold certainty of a commander who had seen enough battles to recognize the shape of a true disaster forming, that withdrawal was no longer going to be simple. Because scattered among the wreckage, moving fast, cutting off escape routes with the same patient precision that had built this entire trap, the human fleet was already closing in to make sure that as few of his ships as possible would ever make it home to warn anyone else. The order to withdraw spread through the shattered remains of the Vashtar fleet within minutes, but giving an order and carrying it out were two very different things. High Marshal Threx Cullen had led enough retreats in his long career to know that a retreat only worked if the enemy allowed it, and as he watched the tactical display fill with new markers showing human ships moving to intercept his fleeing ships, he understood with growing dread that Admiral Elena Cross had no intention of allowing anything of the sort. They are moving to cut off our path back to the jump point, Vesk reported, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Fast attack squadrons, flanking from both sides. If we maintain our current heading, we will be forced through their formation to reach open space. Threx studied the display, searching for options that did not exist. His fleet, once numbering over 4,000 ships, now stood at just under 1,800, scattered and disorganized after the twin disasters of the disruption weapon and the kinetic bombardment. The humans, despite their smaller numbers, had positioned themselves with terrifying precision, using their superior speed and their intimate knowledge of the battlefield to control exactly where and how the remaining Vashtar ships could move. Concentrate remaining firepower into 3 defensive groups, Threx ordered. We punch through their flanking formations by force. Overwhelming numbers still favor us if we commit fully. It was, in the end, still the right instinct. Even reduced, even scattered, a fleet of 1,800 Vashtar warships carried more raw firepower than anything humanity had ever built. If Threx could concentrate that force and drive it like a spear through the human lines, he could still break free, still save enough ships to carry word of this disaster back to the Dominion, still preserve enough strength to return one day, with a fleet built specifically to avenge this defeat. Admiral Cross had anticipated this too. They're committing to a breakthrough attempt, Webb reported from his station, watching the enemy formation shift and concentrate. 3 groups, converging on our southern flank. If they get through, we lose containment on at least 40% of their remaining fleet. Cross studied the display without speaking for a long moment. This was the part of the plan that had kept her awake more nights than any other, the moment where 15 years of preparation would either hold or fail against the desperate strength of a cornered enemy. She had built this entire campaign around one central truth about the Vashtar, that her intelligence teams had confirmed again and again through years of study. The Dominion had never, in 3,000 years of conquest, fought an opponent who refused to simply accept the mathematics of a losing battle. Every species they had ever crushed had eventually broken, either through surrender or through the collapse of organized resistance once losses grew too steep. The Vashtar War doctrine, refined over 3 millennia, was built on the assumption that overwhelming force would always, eventually, produce that break. Humanity did not intend to break. Bring up Fleet Group Hammer, Cross said. All reserves, full commitment. We do not let them punch through. If we lose containment now, this whole system stays a battlefield for years instead of days. The order sent the last of humanity's prepared forces into the fight, a reserve fleet of nearly 400 vessels that had been held back specifically for this moment, built not for speed or stealth like the earlier waves, but for raw, sustained close-range combat. These ships had been designed around a simple, brutal philosophy that human military planners had developed after decades of studying the Vashtar's own conquest history. If you could not out-armor an enemy, and could not outgun them ship for ship, you could still outwill them, if your people were willing to trade blood for time, and your commanders were willing to spend it. The two forces met at the southern flank, in a battle that would later be studied in military academies for generations, human and Vashtar alike, though for very different reasons on each side. Threx's concentrated spear of Vashtar warships tore into the human line with devastating force, and for the first 20 minutes, It looked as though sheer weight of firepower might carry the day after all. Human ships died in numbers that made Cross's chest tighten with every report that came across her console. Each name a person she had trained, briefed, and sent into a fight she had known from the beginning might cost more lives than anyone wanted to count. But the human ships did not break, and they did not retreat, even as their losses mounted. Every captain in Fleet Group Hammer had been briefed on exactly what this moment required of them, and every one of them held their position, trading their own ships for time, for a few more minutes of containment, for the chance to keep the Vashtar fleet bottled up just long enough for the rest of the plan to finish falling into place. "Marshal, we are breaking through," one of Threx's tactical officers reported, a note of desperate hope entering his voice for the first time since the battle began. "Southern formation is buckling, estimated clear path to the jump point within minutes." Threx allowed himself the smallest measure of relief. If his ships could reach the jump point, even a fraction of his remaining fleet, the Dominion would know what had happened here. They would know the price of underestimating this strange, stubborn species, and they would return with force enough to make sure it never happened again. He gave the order to push the breakthrough, to commit everything remaining toward the widening gap in the human line. It was exactly the moment Cross had been waiting for. "They've fully committed to the breakout," Webb reported, watching the Vashtar formation pour through the weakening southern flank. All remaining combat strength focused on that single vector. "Good," Cross said quietly. "Close the trap." The order went out to a force that had remained hidden throughout the entire battle, a force so well concealed that even the most thorough Vashtar sensor sweeps had never detected it. Positioned along the exact trajectory that any fleeing Vashtar fleet would be forced to travel to reach open space and the safety of a jump point, humanity's final and most secret weapon activated, a field of mines, thousands of them, drifting silent and powered down along the predicted escape corridor, seeded there years earlier by slow, quiet automated vessels that had never once triggered a Vashtar alarm. As the surviving Vashtar fleet surged forward through the gap in the human line, believing they had finally broken free, they instead sailed directly into a minefield built with the same patient, ruthless precision as everything else humanity had prepared for this battle. Ships that had survived the disruption weapon, survived the kinetic bombardment, and survived the desperate close-range fighting at the southern flank began detonating the moment they crossed into the seeded corridor, explosions rippling through the fleeing formation, faster than any commander could react. Threx felt the Dominion's will shudder violently as something struck near its rear engines, alarms flooding the bridge with reports of catastrophic damage. Around him, on every display, more ships were dying, some outright destroyed, others crippled and drifting, easy prey for the human fast attack squadrons that had pulled back only long enough to let the mines do their work before closing in once more to finish what remained. "Marshal, we have lost engine capacity on the port side," Vesk reported, his voice finally cracking under the weight of everything they had witnessed. "Fleet strength is now under 400 vessels and continuing to fall. We cannot reach the jump point through the minefield without further losses." Threx stood on the bridge of his crippled flagship and looked at the tactical display, at the wreckage of what had been, only a day earlier, the largest and most powerful fleet the Vashtar Dominion had ever assembled. 4,300 ships had entered this system, believing they carried certain victory with them. Fewer than 400 remained, and that number was still falling with every passing minute. He thought of Vesk's warnings, weeks ago, about the strange pattern buried in humanity's old radio transmissions. "We do not know how to lose." He had dismissed it as the arrogance of a young species. He understood now, watching his fleet die around him, that it had not been arrogance at all. It had been a simple statement of fact, and he had led his entire fleet to its destruction because he had refused to take it seriously. "Find any path clear of the minefield," Threx ordered, his voice quiet now, stripped of the certainty it had carried only days before. "Any path at all. Get as many ships through as you can." But there was no clear path, not for the vast majority of what remained. Ship after ship attempted to navigate through gaps in the deadly field, and ship after ship either struck a mine or fell to the human fast attack squadrons still sweeping through the wreckage, methodically ensuring that as few Vashtar vessels as possible would survive to carry word of this defeat back to the Dominion. By the time the sun rose over the eastern seaboard of a small country, on Earth's northern continent, a full rotation of the planet after the battle had first begun. The once mighty Vashtar fleet had been reduced to a scattering of broken, drifting hulks, and a single ship, badly damaged but still functional, desperately fighting its way toward the outer edge of the system, with every remaining scrap of power its engines could produce. That ship was the Dominion's will, and aboard it, High Marshal Threx Colin watched the last of his fleet die on the screens around him, and began, for the first time in 100 years of service to the Dominion, to understand exactly what it meant to lose. The Dominion's will limped through the outer edge of the human system, with barely a third of its power systems still functioning, its hull scarred and blackened along its port side, its engines burning far hotter than their design allowed simply to keep the ship moving at all. High Marshal Threx Colin stood on the bridge, surrounded by the quiet, shell-shocked silence of a crew that had spent the last day watching everything they believed about their own strength collapse around them. Vesk stood at the tactical station, watching the sensor readouts with a kind of numb disbelief that had not yet faded, even hours after the worst of the fighting had ended. "Marshal, long-range scans show no further human vessels pursuing us. It appears they have allowed us to reach the jump point." Threx said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the dark, empty space ahead of them, the edge of the system that had swallowed his entire fleet in less than 2 days of fighting. He had entered this system with 4,300 ships, more warships than most Vashtar commanders would see in their entire careers, and now, as far as his sensors could confirm, the Dominion's will was the only one still capable of making the jump home. "They do not need to pursue us," Threx said finally, his voice quiet and hollow. "They want us to return. They want the Dominion to know exactly what happened here." He was right, though he would not learn how right until much later. 300 million kilometers away, in the Deep Space Command Center where she had spent the last 2 days without sleep, Admiral Elena Cross watched the final sensor reports confirming that a single, badly damaged Vashtar ship had crossed the outer boundary of the system and prepared to make the jump back toward Dominion space. Colonel Webb stood beside her, his face drawn with exhaustion, but something in his eyes suggested he already understood the decision she was about to make. "We could still stop it," Webb said quietly. "We have ships in range. One clean strike and there's no witness left to carry word back to their empire." Cross considered this for a long moment, watching the lone Vashtar ship's trajectory on the display. It would have been easy. After everything humanity had lost in this battle, after every name she had read on the casualty reports over the last 2 days, it would have been simple, even satisfying, to make sure that not a single Vashtar ship survived, to tell anyone what had happened here. "No," she said finally. "Let it go." "Sir? They need to know what they're dealing with, Marcus. If we erase every witness, they'll come back in 5 years, thinking this system was undefended and got lucky. They'll come back with 10,000 ships instead of 4,000, and next time, we might not have 15 years to prepare a welcome. But if that ship makes it home, if their people hear exactly what happened here from someone who watched it happen, maybe they think twice before trying again. Maybe fear does more for us than another kill ever could." Webb nodded slowly, understanding settling over his tired features. "You want them to be afraid." "I want them to understand," Cross said. "There's a difference. Fear fades. Understanding, if it's deep enough, changes how a whole civilization thinks. I want the next commander who looks at a star map and sees our system to remember exactly what happened to the last one who thought it would be easy." The lone Vashtar ship made its jump unimpeded, and the last human eyes to see it disappear into the folded space of faster-than-light travel belonged to a young sensor technician who had spent the entire battle monitoring enemy movements from a hidden station buried deep inside an asteroid, and who now watched the final trace of the Dominion's will vanish from her screen with a strange, quiet feeling that was neither triumph nor relief, but something closer to solemn understanding of just how much this victory had truly cost. The jump home took the Dominion's will nearly 3 weeks, its damaged systems unable to sustain the higher speeds a healthy ship might have managed. Threx spent much of that time in the ship's small observation chamber, alone, reviewing the battle data again and again, searching for the moment where a different decision might have changed the outcome. He found none. Every choice he had made had been sound. By every standard of warfare the Dominion had refined over 3,000 years of conquest. The failure had not been in his tactics. It had been in his understanding of the enemy he faced. an understanding built entirely on old assumptions about what a young, small civilization could and could not do. When the Dominion's will finally reached the edge of Vashtar space and made contact with a relay station, word of the disaster spread through the Dominion faster than any official report could travel. By the time Threx stood before the full assembled council of Dominion elders, delivering his account of the battle in person, the story had already reached every corner of Vashtar territory in fragments and rumors, each version more staggering than the last. The council chamber fell silent as Threx finished his report, laying out in careful, precise detail exactly how a fleet of 4,300 ships had been reduced to a single damaged vessel in less than 2 days of fighting. He spoke of the disruption weapon that had crippled his front lines before the battle had truly begun. He spoke of the fast, precise human warships that had refused every attempt to draw them into a conventional engagement. He spoke of the hidden kinetic platforms, the minefield laid years in advance, and the reserve fleet that had held its ground even as losses mounted past any point the Vashtar War doctrine considered survivable. "They did not fight the way we expected," Threx said, his voice steady now, though something in his manner had permanently changed since the battle. "They fought the way their own history suggested they might, if we had taken the warning seriously. They do not measure a battle by the numbers on either side. They measure it by whether they are willing to pay whatever price victory demands. And they were willing to pay more than we ever imagined a young species could bear." One of the elder council members, a Vashtar, who had served the Dominion for over 400 years, leaned forward with an expression Threx had rarely seen on his kind. It was something close to genuine concern. "You are suggesting we should not return." "I am suggesting," Threx said carefully, "that if we return, we should not return believing this will be easy. We should return understanding that this species has already shown us it is capable of building weapons, tactics, and traps we did not anticipate, using nothing more than 15 years of quiet preparation and a deep, unshakable will to survive. If we send another fleet believing the mathematics still favor us the way they did before, we will lose that fleet as well." The council debated for many days after Threx's report, and in the end, no immediate decision was reached to send a second invasion force. The losses from the first campaign had been staggering enough to give even the most confident voices in the Dominion pause, and the strange, unsettling stories that filtered out from surviving crew members, tales of a species that fought like they had nothing left to lose even when everything was on the line, spread through Vashtar territory in ways official reports never could. Vesk, promoted in the aftermath of the battle to a command of his own, spent the following years quietly building a new intelligence division within the Dominion military, one dedicated entirely to studying humanity, not with the old assumptions of an ancient empire looking down at a young species, but with the careful respect owed to an enemy who had proven, in a single devastating battle, that strength could not always be measured by the size of a fleet. Back on Earth, Admiral Elena Cross stood before a memorial wall that had been completed only weeks after the battle ended, a wall bearing the names of every crew member lost aboard the ships of Fleet Groups Anvil and Hammer, the volunteers who had traded their lives for the plan that ultimately saved their home world. She read through the names slowly, the way she did every week since the wall's completion, and thought of the strange, quiet moment when she had chosen to let a single broken enemy ship escape into the dark, rather than erase every witness to what had happened here. She did not know, standing there in the quiet morning light, whether the Vashtar Dominion would ever return. She did not know whether the story that lone surviving ship carried home would be enough to keep the peace, or whether it would simply buy humanity a handful more years to prepare for a war that might still come one day. But she understood something that Threx Collin had come to understand as well, in his own way, standing before his own council on the far side of the galaxy. Sometimes the greatest victory was not simply winning a battle. It was making sure the enemy understood, deep in whatever passed for their heart, exactly what it would cost them to ever try again. 4,300 ships had entered human space, believing conquest would be swift and certain. Only one had survived to carry the truth back home, and that single surviving ship, more than any victory message or triumphant broadcast ever could have, told the story better than words alone ever would. Humanity had been ready, humanity had been patient, and humanity, when finally pushed to defend everything they had shown the galaxy exactly what those old, half-forgotten stories about impossible odds had always been trying to say. They did not know how to lose. And on that day, above the skies of their home world, they had proven it, beyond any doubt, the Dominion would ever be able to ignore again.